Hello everyone, welcome to the August meetup of Cloud Native Brisbane. We've had some amazing participation for our last meetups, and I can see that we've had some really strong participation even today too. As always, please join the meetup group to be notified of events whenever they are set up. These meetups are recorded and the meetup sessions are available on YouTube. I put a link to the YouTube channel on the screen. The links for this meetup, for the YouTube channel, can also be found on the meetup group. In terms of code of conduct, please be mindful of the code of conduct and be respectful of all participants. It's a very simple code of conduct. Today's session is about Azure Container Apps. This session is being presented by Adam Stephensen. Adam Stephensen is from Microsoft. He's an Azure Innovation Specialist over there. I've had the pleasure of working with Adam on onboarding cloud native apps to Azure for a couple of years now. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about Azure Container Apps from Adam. Over to you, Adam.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cloud Native User Group. I'm Adam Stephensen. I'm an application innovation specialist at Microsoft. So my job's working with our customers. I specifically specialize in the FSI space around helping them envision where technology and Azure in particular could help them with innovation. I've got a 25-year background as an application developer, and I'm here today to talk around just some perspectives around cloud native. Very open to having if anything comes up and you want to ask questions, it's much rather have a discussion and have people present their points of view as well. So don't be afraid to come off mute and call out. I can't really see the chat, so if anyone does see interesting chat come up, if they could call it out, that'd be excellent. I love this picture. I do a lot of presentations and I buy all my images and stuff off Adobe stock. This came up a couple of years ago and the caption on it was team of programmers working in an office. And I love this image. When I saw it, I sat back and had a bit of a chuckle to myself because there's a bit of code up on the screen. Looks like they've done a regex and they're highlighting some text on the other side. But they all look so happy and they look all so relaxed. And their desks and everything is so very clean. And this might be some people in an office, but they're definitely not developers. And that's because the image that I saw that really emoted me to this is what my days and what development feels like is much more like this. I saw this image about 5 years ago, and it made me go, oh, that's what I feel like today. And look, that's my job is trying to take the developers and the organizations I work with that are feeling like this and making their life a bit better and helping the organizations I'm working with deliver value. And there's a wide range of ways to do that, but and that's kind of what I want to talk around today is some of the ways that we do that in a cloud native way. So I'm going to cover a couple of things. I'm going to start off with a demo. I don't want to just do slides the whole way. So I'm going to start off with a demo of standing up a container-based web application using a Node.js API, talking back to a database, all hosted in the cloud. And I'm going to stand that up and get it deploying to the cloud with CI/CD. And then once it's actually going through and deploying, then I'm going to have a bit of a talk through the different cloud native offerings. So I'm from Microsoft, I work in the Azure space. So I'm going to talk through a bit of the different ways that I help customers build things in the cloud on cloud native offerings. How does that sound? Awesome, I've got a thumbs up, I'll take that. Don't be afraid to come off mute. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fire up a Windows terminal. So I could be doing this at the command line. If you haven't, if you're on Windows, check out the new Windows. Check out Windows Terminal. It's awesome. It lets you do PowerShell, command prompt, straight Azure Cloud Shell. Or I've got Windows Subsystem for Linux installed, so I'm going to work at that. So there is a new command line tool. If you're familiar with working with Azure, you'll know that there's the Azure CLI. we've actually got there's a new developer specific Azure CLI. And the command line, it's AZD is the command for that. So what I'm going to do, I'll show you what I'm going to do before I go and do it. I'm going to use, and you can go through and do all the steps in this demo I'm going to do from this, what is the Azure Developer CLI preview step. There are a bunch of templates, and I'm going to use the Azure Developer CLI to stand up a template. The templates come in Node, Python, and C#. I'm going to use Node. You could have Node talking to a Mongo database, or a static web app using React talking to a serverless Azure function in Node talking back to a database. But because we're the cloud native user group, and depending, we were talking before the session started around, depending on your definition of cloud native, does serverless count and PaaS count, or is it purely containers? I thought I'd keep it to a containers demo just to keep everybody happy. So what we're going to do is we're going to deploy, and to do application, I'm going to click on the template actually. I'm open the template up. So there's a bunch of templates we could deploy. This is the one we're going to deploy. And what we're going to have is a React.js to do application that's going to be containerized, a Node.js API that'll also be containerized. And those two containers, the images will be stored in the Azure Container Registry, and the containers will be hosted in Azure Container Applications, which essentially is a serverless platform for hosting containers without having to manage the infrastructure. So it's an abstraction over the top of Kubernetes. And then it's going to deploy a Cosmos DB database and use the Mongo API. It's going to deploy Azure Key Vault for storing our secrets, and the Azure Monitor for all of our monitoring and logging. So this is the architecture I'm going to stand up now from that template. And all I need to do is AZD, which is the command line. I'm going to use the up keyword, I'm going to use the up keyword, and then I'm going to come in and specify the template. And the template that I'm going to deploy is the one from that GitHub repo. So it's the to-do application on Node, using a MongoDB and deploying on Azure Container Apps. So that's as simple as the command is. And what that's going to do now, oh, actually, I did something wrong. What I should have done first was made a directory, so otherwise it's going to get messy. Okay, let me try that again. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to say, I want to do an AZD up, and I'm going to go and get that template and use that template. So what that's doing now is it's going to the GitHub repository that was the home of this template. And you can see that this here has the infrastructure as code. It has the code for the two applications, as well as all of the deployment information that it needs to go and configure CI/CD. Now it's saying enter a new environment name. So this is the resource group name or the folder name in Azure that it's going to deploy to. So I'm going to specify that name. It's then going to ask me what Azure region do I want to deploy to, and what Azure subscription to use. And that's all I need to do. And what this is going to do is it's going to get that template that has all of the infrastructure defined in an infrastructure template as infrastructure as code. It's also got the code needed for the two applications, as well as all the plumbing required to wire it up. And it's bringing that locally to my machine, and then it's going to execute that infrastructure as code to go and deploy all of those resources in the cloud. Once it's got that, it's actually going to compile the two applications, the React app and the Node application, containerize those and host them in that Azure Container Apps environment that is just deployed. So this is actually going to go and stand all of that up now, which is pretty awesome. What this doesn't do, though, is a good friend of mine, said, friends don't let friends right-click publish, and that's what we've really done here. We don't have, a GitHub repository or a Azure Devops repository with CI/CD. But we can go and very easily configure that. So I'm just going to open up another terminal window and change into that folder. And all I need to do is to use one more command. So I'm going to go and use my Azure Developer Cli again, and I'm going to go and say pipeline config. And what that's going to do, make sure that it's, yeah, let's apply my resources. It's going to now take that local folder that it copied the code down into and turn that into a GitHub and turn that into a Git repository. Inside that Git repository, then it's going to say, now let's go and publish that out to a destination. So I'm going to say, go and publish it out to a new private GitHub repository and then give it a name. So I'm going to use the suggested name, which is just Adam S 1908. So it's now created a Git repo out of that template that it had copied down locally to my machine. And now it's pushing that code out to GitHub. Once it pushes it out there, it's actually going to ask me if I want to kick off a GitHub action. And what a GitHub action is it's the automated tooling. So do I want to commit and push my changes? I'm going to say yes. So what that's done is that has pushed the code back out to GitHub and set up an automated CI/CD process. So whenever that code changes out in GitHub, it's automatically going to take that, execute a CI/CD pipeline and update the code in Azure that we've just, for the resources that we've just configured. So if you haven't done this before, setting this up the right way to set up all of that infrastructure for this kind of an application, where's the architecture? So if you haven't, to set this, this is a relatively simple app. It's a web app with an API talking to a database, but using containers with monitoring and no secrets. All of the secrets are contained in a key vault. Setting this up with CI/CD and infrastructure as code the first time often takes people weeks or months to try and work it out through the documentation. The idea of this is you obviously don't know everything. You still need to go and learn everything, but you can get set up the right way, and it's much easier to go and unpick it and learn it once you've got it all working in the right way. So what I could do in here then is go and jump into whatever your local IDE is. I could come and jump into Azure. I could open it up in VS Code. Actually, I'm not going to use VS Code. So I could come in here, and if you haven't used VS Code, it's a really great editor. So this is running on my local machine. I can come in here, but actually instead of doing it in VS Code, I'm going to do something better. So this is VS Code running on my desktop. I'm going to come and remember how I pushed it out. Has anyone got any questions from where I'm up to so far?
No, we are
no questions coming in
the room, Adam.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I said I pushed it up to that GitHub repository. So I'm going to come into here to GitHub/Adam Stephensen, where I pushed that code to. And you can see here in my repositories, if I go into my repositories, it's created this 19. So here's where it pushed that code to. So I could come in here and I can see all the different folders that contain. So this is literally a copy of that repository that I went and showed earlier. But this is what's now being deployed directly into that instance of Azure. What I can do is I could come in here and edit, go into my source code and make a change to my code, and it would be automatically deployed. Everyone, I hope, is kind of familiar with the normal GitHub IDE and being able to go and edit files in here. What a lot of people aren't familiar with is the fact that there is now that VS Code editor running on my desktop is now built into GitHub. So you can literally on any repository, like this one that I've got open here, come and press the full stop key on your keyboard. And what it's going to do is open the VS Code editor in your browser for that repository. So I think that's pretty awesome because this is a really nice development experience. So now that we've opened up that repo, which is tied to my deployment, we'll just come and have a bit, I'll just do a very light touch overview of what's in this solution and how this is all hanging together. Look, we have our, the infrastructure as code piece is probably the first piece. If you haven't worked with infrastructure as code, if you're building things, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, and you're going into your cloud portal and going, oh, give me a new database, give me a new web application. The trouble with that is obviously, you don't have the ability to create dev and test and prod and be guaranteed that they're all exactly the same. What's a much better practice is to describe what that environment looks like in a file that you check in with your code, and then it automatically deploys it to your first environment. And then as you promote through your other environments, it updates it as it goes along. I've worked with Terraform heaps. The native templating language is Azure, and Azure is ARM. ARM can get a little bit confusing for people. So there's an abstraction over ARM, which really simplifies ARM and makes it much nicer, and that's called Bicep. So what we can do is we can actually come in and have a look at our Bicep file, and we can actually see in the Bicep file here all of the resources that are being, we can come in and we can come through and we can see all of the resources that are being provisioned to actually go and stand up our environment. So I showed you that that high-level architecture diagram, and you saw that there was a container registry there that actually holds the container images. This is the code that defines that and is going to deploy that. There's the code, the resource for the Key Vault policies, app insights. We can come down here and we can see our web application and our log analytics, our Cosmos DB. So this is where all of the items that are being deployed are all configured, including even in the Cosmos DB, the different collections, which is the database name. So this is going to go and deploy all of the resources that we require to run this solution. Then in our source folder, we can go and see, here is the source for our Node.js API. So we can come and have a look. Here are our, our Node.js classes. We can come here and in here and make the changes. We can also see there's a Docker file because we're Dockerizing the web application and the API. Very simple Docker file for a Node app. We're going to deploy those both out to Azure Container Apps.
Is this a good time to ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Since we're using Bicep to deploy resources, what about security? Is it using a service account, or if it has access to create ACR or other resources? How does it authenticate itself, and how does it have access to create those other resources?
So so this is where I've actually got a security I've got a security colleague that goes and does that piece usually for me, but it's actually using so it uses it all deploys it all using managed identity. So if we came in and drilled into the details of that in the infrastructure, so if we come back in for the infrastructure and we come back into the resources, there's a section in here around, so all of the connection strings as they're created are stored in the Key Vault, but it comes in here and it sets up managed identity policies. But I'd have to come back to you with the final details of how that plumbs in.
No worries, thanks.
But yeah, so where is it? Yeah, let me come. Who was that who asked that question?
This is Pradeep.
Oh, it's Pradeep. Let me come back to you, Pradeep.
No worries.
Yeah, so when we can drill into the web application, we can drill down into, so, you know, this is just a normal React app. Once again, so we could come in here and in the layout, let me see if it's finished deploying first. It has. So just before I make a change, you can see this is now finished. If I opened up the terminal again, we can see that this is finished deploying. It's giving me a link to my API endpoints. So I can jump in here and open that link, and that will give me the Swagger oops, I get the wrong link. Let me try that again. Yep, there we go. So there's there's a lists API and there's an items API because it's a to-do list application. So that's the endpoints for the API. Or I can come in here and click the web application itself. And we can see here that the React application is actually running. Oops. Looks like it's not fully deployed, which is a little strange. Okay, we can see that that's there, but something I think isn't quite right there because that should be the application. It's either not fully deployed. Anyway, we might be able to fix that by doing what we're going to do next. So I am going to jump back into the UI here for the layout. I'm going to come in and what I was going to show you is that up the top there somewhere it says, sorry, not in the header, it says to do, and I'm going to say to do cloud native. And then because this is my normal Visual Studio IDE, I come in here and I can go update header and I can actually do a commit. So that's, I've just changed the code and committed it. If I jump back into into my GitHub, actually I have to open a new one. If I go back into that repository, and I go into my GitHub Actions, what I'll see is I can say, see how that first one, the reason the app wasn't showing is it's still doing that initial deployment up, which it's just finished doing. So now I'm actually having a bit of trouble. I don't know how to shrink. How do I move the Zoom header bar? Oh, there we go. Great. Make it easier. So we can see that it's actually finished that first deployment. So now if I go in and refresh this, now I've got my web application. So it did that initial deployment. You can see the header is to do. When we go and look up GitHub Actions, we've changed that header code. It's automatically kicked off another build. And in a second, what we're going to see is that it's actually redeployed and that header will have updated. Is that pretty cool? So that's a fully containerized front end and API deployed to the cloud and working with CI/CD, all in, with explanations in about 25 minutes. If I was starting an application today, and there was a great question about the security piece there. The reality is, I know that's something that I don't do day to day. I have somebody else come and do that bit for me. This kind of goes and wires it up. Saves me having to go research it. I would definitely go and pull that apart and get an understanding of the right way to do it. But the nice thing is generally I have somebody else who's going and checking that stuff for me, or I've got to go and do a bunch of research to set it up. But this kind of gets everything working out of the box, and then you can go and backtrack and work out how it's all working for your own peace of mind. The other thing that's worth calling out here is it is actually running security scans over, because we're using GitHub. It's actually a bit of a shame. So the current version that it's pulling down doesn't have any security vulnerabilities. When I did this demo last week or the week before, one of the dependencies actually had a security vulnerability. So as I pushed it, Dependabot ran and actually did an automatic pull request to do an upgrade of one of the dependencies that had a security vulnerability, which is really nice.
Adam, just curious. I mean, I did read that Azure Container Instances was updated to use Kestrel, and it's currently running on Linux, or is it still running on IIS as the web server on the back
For
end?
Azure Container Instances or Azure Web Applications?
Azure Container Instances, or rather Azure Web Application, sorry.
Yeah, so Azure Web Apps now under the covers is now running. Yeah, they've completely changed how it's running under the covers. So it's more performant and is running faster as well. Once again, though, I'm more involved in working with customers to deliver value. So I work in the top half of the stack, and as long as there's value being added and there's good performance, I don't kind of get in too far under the covers.
Sure. The other question was around how do we configure which branches can be deployed? Is there any way we can say that only the master branch can be deployed, or how do we configure branch specific deployment?
Absolutely, and that's kind of the point of this is that this is a great way to get your starting point going. So I've got customers, as I said, a bunch of my customers use Terraform. I've actually got customers that what they're doing is they're using the tool to go and build all their own templates and publish their own templates. So they might have, I work with enterprises and mainly with banks, superannuation insurance companies. Everything they deploy has to go through an architecture review board, a security review. So what they're doing is they're going and building canonical architectures where they're going and building these repositories and going, this has been through security and architecture, and this is a web application. This has been through security and architecture. This is an API for this particular purpose. This has been through security and architecture, and this is how we're going to do Power Apps with this particular use case. They're all reviewed, and they're building these out custom to how their organizational requirements. Because at the end of the day, all it really is I'll jump back in actually now that it's nice doing it in Dev. GitHub.dev is great for when you're doing a quick demo, but what you really want to do is do it in VS Code. Must have shut VS Code down. So the answer to the question is, this is just a project. And so to change all of those things, we provide by default, we're using GitHub, so we're using GitHub pipelines. So in particular here, so you can go and customize your GitHub pipelines to work however you want to work. So we're only at the moment deploying, the main branch to a single environment. We can fully go through and use the full capabilities of GitHub pipelines to deploy from whatever branch we want. I went and used the GitHub pipeline instead of using Azure Devops. We also deploy, I said GitHub pipeline. It's a GitHub Action or an Azure Devops pipeline. So if you want to use an Azure Devops pipeline, this is the Azure Devops pipeline YAML, which once again enables, at the moment, this is looking at in Azure Devops, either the main or master branch to trigger. You can obviously go and fully customize that to a multi-stage build to multiple environments. Or similarly, we can come in here and fully customize our GitHub Action to work how we want to work.
So these are basically a full-blown template for how you can actually code and describe your infrastructure and deploy as part of a pipeline system as well.
Absolutely. This is, if you want to learn how to build things in Azure and get to do it with Key Vault for security, monitoring and web applications with the database. And this is the easiest way. Go and stand something up that works end to end with a pipeline and then pick it apart, delete the pieces you don't need. And you will learn so much from getting it working and then pulling out the bits you don't need. I mean, this is the reason I like it. This is how I learned to code. I learned to code in BASIC by getting programs and then, changing things and then seeing how things worked, as opposed to starting with things that didn't work at all and having to build it up from scratch, which is most when you go, and this is what I find frustrating as a developer, as I go and I'm like, I know I want to build a web app with an API and a database and key vault for secrets and monitoring, but there's 7 different starter, walkthroughs. There's nothing that takes me from the very beginning to the very end, where this is kind of going to the other end and going, here's the whole thing, go and pick it apart and learn. And that's, people work different ways. I like having something working that I can pick apart. And you've got to do the beginning ones to get an idea of what the technologies are, but I want to see what a good end state looks like. And that's the whole idea of this template.
So as a template registry, can you actually have internal company ones? That's what you're kind of describing with the superannuation companies you're working with.
Absolutely.
They actually create that?
Yep. So you can absolutely go and create your own.
Hey, Adam, quick one. So what you've shown us so far, deploying this app, that was on a Azure Container instance, correct?
Yep.
So what happens, let's say we update the code. How could you give us just a refresh on how the Azure Container instance will redeploy the code? How it will roll out?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's happening is we've got in this particular project, this Azure YAML here. So if we start at the very beginning, this Azure YAML describes the different, so this is the name of the template. And this Azure YAML describes the projects that are contained that are going to be deployed. It by default, by convention, it's going to go and look in the infra folder to go and find the infrastructure to deploy first. So it comes in here and so Bicep is an abstraction over the top of ARM. But we can come in here, not getting too deep into Bicep. And you can see the nice thing about using VS Code is it's giving me syntax highlighting on my Bicep files.
Can you actually use ARM?
Sorry, you can use ARM, yes. So this is only in preview, and we're going to see more and more. We're going to see more and more functionality come into this CLI tool. But you can actually put you can put raw ARM into a Bicep file.
Assuming we're using Bicep, which I can see from say API.bicep, that's where you're provisioning the container. If you just go up to API.bicep.
Yep.
Because you're using the existing container app environment. Let's say we update the code for the API service. I'm not sure which folder it's sitting in, but let's say we update that code. How would Bicep then redeploy that code, redeploy that app in that container app environment?
Well, so that it all gets triggered via. So that's why I had to do 2 commands. So the first command that I did, I'm going to jump back to the official docs. The first command that I did, so this is the official docs. And there's the range of templates. So for different languages. The first command I did, it's off one of the links for getting started. Get started, there we go. This very first command, so that tells you how to install it. That azd up command is saying, go and get the template, bring it locally and go and execute that template, which deploys the infrastructure and then deploys the application. The second command can either be for Azure Devops or for GitHub. And is it not on this page? No. It's on this page here, configure deployment pipeline. And this one here, AZ pipeline config, what that says is create the Git repository locally, push it out to GitHub, and enable GitHub Actions. And what GitHub Action, and once that's done, what GitHub Actions do is GitHub Actions is monitoring everything in this repository. So whenever anything in this repository changes, it goes and executes a GitHub action. And the GitHub action is contained within this GitHub Workflows folder. And so what that is saying is it's saying, whenever I see a change on these branches, go and execute these jobs and these different build steps. And so it's actually using an image, it's using this image and it's going and creating, multiple steps with GitHub Actions. So it's going and doing a checkout to get the code, it's logging into Azure, and then it's going and provisioning then it's going and doing a infrastructure as code provisioning and then doing a deployment of the application. So it's really then just, it's seeing a trigger in the repository and then executing the GitHub action. And that action is going and doing, reapplying that infrastructure as code as seeing what changes there are and reapplying it, and then rebuilding and redeploying the code.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just not very familiar with AZD provision and AZD deploy. So I'm just still confused. How does it handle the current instance? Does it just destroy it and just...
So AZD, that AZD pipeline config is really just setting up, because there's two, that is really just setting up GitHub Actions, which works in a very similar way to Azure Devops pipelines. And what they're doing is you can make it work however you want to work. It's highly configurable. But the way that infrastructure as code, works, regardless of whether it's, Terraform or ARM or Bicep, is that it does a differential of, what's different between, because it's called, it looks infrastructure as code. It looks at what the current state that is of the environment, and then what is described in the template, and then it just changes changes what the delta is.
Okay. One more question. The creds parameter that has an argument secrets.azure credentials.
Yep.
Would it be safe to assume that's an environment variable in your GitHub?
That's an environment variable in GitHub. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So you need to set up these three.
Well, so it sets all of these up for you. And so that's what's great about this, is it goes through and it actually goes and configures all of that.
As long as you authenticate via CLI to GitHub, I'm guessing you have to log into GitHub.
Yes.
Yeah.
To change the things in GitHub, yes.
Adam, another question. So when you deploy the second time around, does it do a ruling upgrade or other types of deployments possible? What's the deployment strategy that ACI uses to deploy?
So you're talking about the change to the application or the change to the infrastructure?
Yeah. Let's assume I've deployed the application to production. Now I've made a change to code and I want to redeploy it. Does it do a ruling upgrade? What's the sort of strategy that it uses to deploy to an application which is already running in production?
So it's actually configurable depending on, so you can actually go and do blue-green deployments. So that's really configurable depending on, what your settings are and what you want to do with it.
Okay. The other question is, can I split the CI and CD parts of it? Can I deploy rather than code? Is it possible to deploy a container to container instances rather than having to deploy code and it automatically builds a container at the backend?
So sorry. So you want to change the code and split the build out?
So what's happening right now with the demo is we're doing a complete CI/CD build wherein we are changing the code, doing a build, creating the container, and deploying it. But let's assume I want to split it out, wherein I want to split out the CI part of it and the CD part of it, wherein I only want to build a container in the CI part and deploy the container in the CD part of it, right? So can I, rather than deploy code, is it possible to deploy a container to ACI?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So you'd probably do that though. There'd be a couple of different ways of doing it. So you could definitely change your pipeline to just build your container and then stick it in the container registry.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And then then you can fully go and manage deployments however you want to manage your deployments. And particularly, so yeah, there's a number of different strategies there. And that's what you might want to do if you're using another tool for deployment, or you've got your own tooling, or you want to have higher levels of control. Yeah, you can absolutely do that.
Or even if I'm going down the Gitops path, wherein I build my CI is completely different and based on changes to Git, or rather the container registry. Whenever a container registry gets updated with the container with a new image, I deploy based on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Adam, one question. Sorry, I will be the last one. With Azure Container Instances, do you know how it compares to, say, using something like AKS in terms of costs? You know, deploying an app on Azure Container Instance looks pretty easy. Is there any benefit in using something like AKS to this sort of deployment?
So I never even got to, so I would much rather show demo and questions than slides, but I have many, many, many slides. I don't know how long everyone's got, but I have, there are, just quickly touching on a few things, there's lots of different ways to deploy things in Azure. And even so everything on the screen is able to run containers. So you can take a container and stick it in a function. You can take a container and run a container in app service. Then you've got Azure Container. So if you go, I just want to take, containers that I've got in a registry somewhere and run them in a container platform. So you've either got, Azure Kubernetes service, which is pure AKS, and we take care of managing the VMs and the platform for you. Then as a layer of abstraction over the top of that, you've got Azure Red Hat OpenShift, which is, managed Red Hat. So it takes care, it automates a lot more. It's opinionated Kubernetes. It's still Kubernetes, but it's Kubernetes made easier and it's more managed. And then there's Azure Container Apps, which is pure serverless. You put the containers in and they just run. So when you're looking at those three different levels, it's all about control versus management. So Azure Container Apps is fully managed, but you don't get to turn all the dials you want to turn. AKS is pure Kubernetes. You get access to all the dials, but it means that to stand it up, you've got to make about 200 decisions, and you've got to understand the networking and all of the, you really need an infrastructure team to manage. So my position on, my best customers and customer stories and worst customer stories are on Kubernetes. I've got customers who've gone and built their own development platforms for their developers that has enabled their whole organization to deploy exactly the way they want to deploy with meeting their their financial, their highly regulated environments requirements. And they've done an amazing job of enabling developer agility the right way by building on top of AKS. I've also had other organizations who've bit off way more than they can chew. And, they ended up with people doing resume-driven development. And they went, we want to do Kubernetes, and let's Google all the things we should be doing with Kubernetes. And this complexity went through the roof. And after 2 years with 30 developers, shipped nothing. Kubernetes, pure Kubernetes, I've seen is done the best way and the worst way. OpenShift makes it easier, less dials that you need to turn, but you still get a high level of control. Container Apps is the easiest, but you don't get that full control that you get with pure Kubernetes. Now, I've heard a few people say Azure Container Instances. I've pulled Azure Container Instances out of my slide decks. I think the use cases, so Azure Container Instances was around before Azure Container Apps. Azure Container Apps is new. It's much more powerful. It takes care of all of the use cases we had with Azure Container Instances, but is much more flexible. So I don't really use Azure Container Instances as much anymore. I tend to, and Azure Container Apps is almost my go-to now for serverless containers for developers, where Azure Kubernetes Service is really, this is an infrastructure play. You're going to go and build a team to build a platform on Kubernetes. That's my take on it. Does that answer? That was a long question, long answer.
Yeah, no, you had to, I guess, go through all of that. It sounds like container apps basically is really good for developers for development, and Kubernetes more for production, as you AKS and as you Red Hat OpenShift.
Yeah, so Kubernetes. So my customers who do Azure Kubernetes Service really well, the learning curve on Kubernetes is big. And as a cloud native, user group, I'm sure there's a bunch of people. The people here probably are the teams that are running, who are running Kubernetes clusters. So this is you're the people who are running the platforms. But I found lots of orgs who have developers say, I want to use Kubernetes, and they go and they learn some Kubernetes, but not enough. And then at the end, once they've done what they want to do, there's no one to manage the platform. And that's where I see the issue come in with Kubernetes is someone needs to feed the platform in the same way that if you're running virtual machines, you need someone to stay on top of the management of them. And that's why hosted by our good friends at VMware.
Yeah.
And that's what they do is they make that process easier. And Kubernetes is the same, is you need people to maintain that platform.
Are you able to scale? One of the things that Kubernetes is great at, replica sets, because you can have multiple instances of your container. What about Azure Container Apps? Do you know if you can actually have multiple instances of the same container running?
And that is the absolute, and it does it without having to think about it. And so that is the big difference between Azure Container Instance and Azure Container Apps is Azure Container Instance was, we will run a single container for you as easily as possible. Azure Container Apps is, give me your container and we will scale it and we will take care of everything. If people are interested, I don't know, actually I should, how long have we got to go is probably the big question. Because I could deep dive. If anyone wants to do another session, reach out to me if you wanted to deep dive on Azure Container Apps in particular.
Adam, we have another 10 minutes. I think what we'll also do is set up a further deep dive as the next session, maybe.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Yeah, if anyone's interested. Yeah, so the idea of Azure Container Apps is it automatically takes care of all of that scaling for you. It's really about taking away the need to manage. So developers build containers and as replica sets in Kubernetes. Kubernetes is really powerful. It's super configurable and it gives you that massively high level of control. Often though times developers in organizations are, I just want to build a container and then I want to stick it somewhere and I want to make sure that it's up and I want to make sure that it scales and I don't want to take care of all the rest of it. And that's really where Azure Container Apps fits in, is it's Kubernetes under the covers, but it's a layer, it's our layer of abstraction, quite high over the top of Kubernetes, that makes it easy for developers to take workloads and run them. I'm definitely seeing lots of enterprises that have Azure Container Apps for their developers because their developers want to build apps and ship them, but then their infrastructure team has an instance of Azure Container Services running pure Kubernetes, running proper Kubernetes, where, Kubernetes I see as really is the new infrastructure. If you go and buy Sitecore, if you go and buy IBM products, these days, vendors are often shipping containers and Helm charts. If you want to run our service, here's the Helm chart, here's the containers, go and stick it on a Kubernetes cluster. And that really goes off to the modern infrastructure team, which is running the Kubernetes platform, and they're hosting those COTS products. But what developers want to do is just churn out containers and then have them run somewhere. And Azure Container Apps makes it easy. There's also a lot of organizations that are going, well, look, we've got Kubernetes, our infrastructure team will host the developer containers as well. But other orgs are going, because Azure Container Apps is serverless, we can actually let the developers, instead of, and this is a perfect example in this template, we've got business units that have developers. We don't want them to have to talk to engineering at all. We don't want them to need to talk to the Kubernetes infrastructure team. They're going to stand up their own Azure Container Apps environments, deploy their containers, and that will run. Then they've got full agility and full control because they can deploy the whole workload. Because there's no overhead for Kubernetes, there's no overhead for Azure Container Apps. They're able to deploy everything and have full control over that environment.
Adam, that's great. So how would you compare this to, say, Red Hat, OpenShift? Because it seems to offer the similar type of abstraction.
Yeah, look, and this is the Red Hat really sits in the middle. So where AKS is pure Kubernetes, but we host, I'm doing the 10-minute version. When we look at AKS, I don't have a great, so when we look at AKS is Kubernetes where we take care of the control plane. So the control plane is fully managed, but you've got full access to run all the nodes and dials that you have with Kubernetes. What Red Hat's done is they've said, it takes a long time and a lot of learning to be able to fully productionize and make the right decisions to maintain a Kubernetes cluster in the enterprise. And so my perspective on this is I'm working with banks, insurance agencies and superannuation clusters. Before I had this role in Microsoft, I was working with small, nimble dev teams working on smaller projects. I know that those teams there working in smaller organizations, they're using Kubernetes all the time because they're working with small, smart teams that can skill up and deploy things quickly. So I guess I do have to put it in the perspective of, there are small, smart teams around the place who are deep diving on Kubernetes and getting a lot of value out of it because those teams are willing to invest the time in skilling up. I work with enterprise. So in enterprise, there's definitely it's harder to build big teams to maintain big platforms. And OpenShift takes away, 50% of the learning curve. I'm making up 50%. These are actually Red Hat. So Azure Red Hat OpenShift is, OpenShift is built by Red Hat. Azure Red Hat OpenShift is actually maintained. If you go and call support from Red Hat or support from Microsoft for ARO, you go to the same call center and there's Microsoft people and Red Hat people sitting in the same room. So these are Red Hat slides, and they say that 75% of enterprise users say that the complexity of implementation operations are the top blockers to Kubernetes adoption. So they just have trouble with the complexity. So what they try and do is remove the things that are difficult from Kubernetes and make it easier. So out of the box, it has, it's an opinionated version of Kubernetes. Like if you go and stand up Kubernetes, you've got to work out what tooling are you going to use for monitoring? What are you going to use for security? How are you going to go and do CI/CD? All of these things that are choices in Kubernetes, which give you ultimate control. With OpenShift, it's opinionated and you get all of these things out of the box. So you don't have the same level of customization, but you go and deploy Azure Red Hat OpenShift and you just get this stuff built in. So it's a layer of abstraction over the top of Kubernetes, but you've still got more control than you do with Azure Container Apps because it's a full serverless PaaS solution where we take care of everything apart from supplying the container. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so it really is where do you want to sit on that scale?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of enterprise customers. I'm doing some work for Suncorp, and yeah, it seems to be that they'd be sticking for the sort of platforms that are easier to learn. The learning curve in OpenShift is a lot smaller than, say, using a full-blown Kubernetes cluster. So yeah, I agree. But yeah, I'll keep my questions for later. You can just continue with your presentation.
Mohammed, do you want to sync? So, do you want to sync with me directly? And I'm very happy to go on deep dive because I'm working. It sounds like we're working for some of the similars customers. So I'm very happy to put some one-on-one time in to kind of work through wherever you've got questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Anybody else got questions?
I had one, and it was around the use of GitHub, because you actually did that. Was it provision in the command line? And it actually provisioned just to GitHub. Can it provision elsewhere?
At the moment, it works with GitHub and Azure Devops. I don't know, because they're the two that we work with all the time.
So it can actually push code to Azure Devops and it's Git repos.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So I'm back into Azure. I'm back into the project here, and you can see that the GitHub Workflows folder has the GitHub Action code in it and the AZDO Pipelines folder. So that is your Azure DevOps pipeline YAML. So the command, I work with GitHub most of the time these days, but if I go back to the docs, the command for Azure DevOps, okay, it is in there somewhere. If you want to ping me, so who asked that question?
Edwin, I'll ping you separately. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'll put my email address up at the end. Ping me separately because there is I'm just not finding it now that I am.
That's fine. Continue, please.
There is somewhere in here, there is just a link to a resource. Someone also asked earlier around how to create their own template. And that I've got the fact that I've got customers creating their own, literally in the documents here for make your project AZD compatible. That is that is step by step how to go through and create your own templates.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, Edwin. I'll shoot. I'm going to put my email address up, and then because I know it's there in the docs. I just can't find it.
That's fine. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm just going to come back up here. Oops. Excellent. Any other questions? No, excellent. Well, look, everyone, thank you very much for excellent. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Swap those around. There we go. There's my email address. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop me an email. Very happy to reply if you need some assistance. But look, thanks for coming along to the user group. It's great that, and thank you very much, Pradeep, for organising this and for asking me to come along today. It's been a lot of fun, and really want to thank everyone who asked questions and interacted. It makes it much better when you've got some to and fro, because I've done a bunch of these and you just feel like you're talking to your screen and you don't know that there's anyone on the other side. So. Yeah. Thanks heaps. It was a really good session, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yeah, it was a great session for sure.
Really was. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adam. We initially ran into troubles with YouTube streaming. We'll upload the Zoom recording as soon as this, maybe by end of the day today. Again, thanks a lot, Adam, for making time to present at our meetup. It was amazing learning from you, and thanks everyone else for joining in. So enjoy the rest of the day and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks very much.
Have a good weekend,
Cheers.
guys. Bye-bye.